America. My name is Osei-Frimpong. I come to you live every Monday and Thursday to talk about the issues of the day in a way that on Monday tries to make your relationship make a little bit more sense so you don't end up divorced. That's my long-term plan. I want stronger families so that people don't end up divorced, because I think divorce is a form of child abuse. It's not the worst form of child abuse, but yet I think it is a form of child abuse. Children should have access to both parents, right? And a lot of other relationship shows try to focus on you securing the bag or trying to get laid. I am trying to help you think about how to think through relationships in a way that won't end up with you being divorced, which I think is very important. It's the Lord's work I'm doing right here. And if you support me doing, go ahead and go to www.funkyacademic.com, kick in $5, $15, or $50 a month to help me do what I do. And on Thursdays, I do a more political show where I talk about black politics in general. So now let's get right into Oher, the Tuohys, and the Blind Side. All right, so it came out that Michael Oher was in a conservatorship where they pretty much control all of your rights. It's a legal document that I guess is putatively made up for disabled people who aren't to be considered whole people in charge of their rights. So, you know, they can keep you from, your conservator can keep you from getting married. It can sign benefits on your behalf. It's pretty much an adjacent you. It's a stronger version of a power of attorney or a variety of power of attorney that can frustrate your own rights. Not just act on your behalf, but actually keep you from acting on your own behalf. It's a bizarre relationship. So why would Michael Oher sign on for one? Well, he was told that it's kind of like an adoption. And if you were like me and didn't have, and he was signed into this when he was 17 or 18 years old, and it really doesn't matter if he was 17 or 18, legally adult or legally not adult. It doesn't really matter because he was young, right? And if you're told that this is kind of like an adoption by someone you trust, you're not a lawyer, you're not going to know enough you're not going to have an outside opinion. You're not going to have access to an outside opinion. This is why everyone should have legal access, legal care as a matter of right in the United States. We're going to be a nation of laws. We need to give everyone lawyers because laws are very specific. And unless you have schooling in that specific area of law or law in general, especially and ideally in that specific area of law, you need to have guaranteed access to a specialist who's working on your behalf. So Oher, at any point in time, should have had access to someone who's not in the Tuohy sphere of influence to explain to him what this conservatorship meant. Instead, we live in a nation of laws, and he was kind of suborned into signing away his rights. And the result is that Sean Tuohy, the dad, is a friend of Michael Lewis, the writer, who, you know, wrote a lot of other books, kind of niche narrative, journalistic nonfiction. So Tuohy's childhood friends with Michael Lewis. Michael Lewis writes the book The Blind Side from, it seems to be, Tuohy's perspective. Now, a lot of focus is put on Leanne Tuohy, but that's how white supremacy works. Right? The gender is used to kind of obfuscate some of the nonsense that the whites try to perpetrate upon us blacks. So Lewis is a childhood friend of Tuohy, writes the book The Blind Side, gets optioned by a studio. The distribution deal falls through. So what happens is one of Tuohy's neighbors is the FedEx CEO, owns Alcorn Distribution and Production Company. They distribute the movie. Everybody gets points. Like everybody gets a cut. Who's involved in the movie. Everyone gets a cut in the movie, including the Tuohys and all of the Tuohy children, except for Oher, who gets nothing. And not only that, he's depicted as a rube, which actually, when you listen to his interview, kind of hurts his feelings, because now he has to live the rest of his NFL career in locker rooms where people don't even know if he's smart enough to memorize a playbook. And he's like, look, they depict me as not being able to read and write, but by second grade, I was in plays. He was an All-American when he was taken in, so it's not like they just found a big Negro. and taught him how to play football. No, he was already a football prospect. This is the equivalent of if LeBron, so he wasn't LeBron James, but if you're taking 15-year-old LeBron James, people already know who LeBron James is in Akron. And someone did actually take in 15-year-old LeBron, or 13-year-old LeBron James, an AAU coach. But he was already a very good basketball player. Black people, we have too many stories like this. Simone Biles is the same way. It's because America has destroyed our families and our families' capacity to actually not just protect, but provide as families. So we end up having to foster our talent elsewhere. And I feel like that's another call for reparations and another reason why black people need to be made whole, because the nation has destroyed black families in so many different ways. So in a well-ordered world, his mom wouldn't have been addicted to crack, and she would have just been able to raise and shepherd him appropriately, and his father too would have been able to raise and shepherd him appropriately. And the funny thing about crack is, especially in that age, it would have been the 80s and 90s, when the mom was going through it. It was the Republican White House who flooded the streets with it. So this has the markers of a more interesting story than the Tuohy's largesse. So what happened is, it turns out that this conservatorship is not like an adoption. It's kind of like an adoption, Michael. And the person who wrote The Blind Side is in cahoots with the dad. The lawyer is another family friend. The movie's distributed by another family friend. So while all of these people are slicing up Michael Oher, like he's just on the menu. Let's not even pretend that he was at the table. He was on the menu. And you could say, well, he wouldn't have gone to Mississippi. No, he was a huge guy who was already he went to Ole Miss and then went on to the NFL. He was a huge guy who was already working, and this is by his own admission. He was already working to go to the NFL. Like he was a big guy who wanted to be a professional football player. He had already gotten offers. He got multiple offers. He didn't need the Tuohy's help to get into Ole Miss. With any sort of stable and marginal parenting, Oher was going to be an NFL player. He was going to play, if anything, except literally a crack addict parent. He was on the track to play professional football, at least D1 football. He did not need Sean Tuohy. Sean Tuohy, the Tuohy's wanted a payday, and they got a payday. So anytime someone says, let's talk a little bit about families. Anytime someone says, well, you're like a member of the family, ask to see their will. I would like to see all of the Tuohy's wills for the last 10 years. Any changes they made in the wills in the last 10 years. If Michael Oher is named alongside all of the other Tuohy children, then he was like family. But I strongly suspect that the little white kids, the little Tuohy children with the right last name, were named as part of the family, and Oher was, well, he's an NFL player. He'll do fine. He doesn't need the family money or the family trust or anything like that. Right? So, family means you have a unified interest. Don't just throw that word around. There was no unified interest. There was a unified interest in exploiting him, and there was a happy convergence of disparate interests for a small bit of time. But let's stop pretending that there's a stable, unified interest between the Tuohy's and Michael Oher. And that should be the moral of this story. These coaches, it's funny, these coaches pitch themselves as your fathers, but they're really parasites. And by the way, a lot of what parenting is managing the parasites who are set to feed on your children, who get profited to feed on you. That's what parenting is. It's managing the parasites. If people tell you that it's other things, they might be lying to you. I'm telling you, your job is to manage the parasites, because you won't know how to do everything. So you need experts to teach your kids certain things, because nobody knows how to do everything. We live in a specialized world. But your job as a parent is to protect them from the disparate interests of those parasites. I mean, there are all these horror stories about blue chip athletes going to college and then getting hosed by donors and agents and managers and all the parasites because they don't have anyone to protect them from the parasites. But so the idea that we want to create strong families with a unified interest to protect kids from the parasitic relationships of civil society. But instead, the Tuohys came in like a wolf in sheep's clothing. They were the parasites, but they were pitching themselves as family whose job it is to protect Tuohy from the parasites, but they were the whole parasites. Like little vampires, you invited them in. And that, I think, is a problem. But it's a systemic problem insofar as Black families are just not stable enough, both materially and culturally, to protect from the parasites. And that is everything to do with the degradation, the generational degradation. I shouldn't say Black families, I'm saying lineage ADOS families. The generational degradation is what makes it the case that, like, Tina Turner's parents were crap, and Ike Turner's parents were crap, were victimized and terrorized, and LeBron's mom couldn't do all that it took, and LeBron should have a dad, and I mean, I think I said before at the top of the show, every child should have a right to parents, a unified parental figure that is immediately tied with their interests through love. And when you don't, you try to hire that out with some strangers, you get problems because they have their own interests. They have to take care of their own family. And that I think is a problem. So the white story is that racial justice will happen because nice white ladies will take pity on the worthy Negro. Especially if they're big enough to set the edge for Ole Miss. But I don't think that's like I don't think you should have to be NFL size or a prospect to get loving support for your aspirations. And two, this as a matter of right or should have not been gifted a benevolent white lady. He should have been gifted a lawyer to read the conservative on his side, to read the conservatorship agreement and say that, like, actually, no, adoption's a completely different thing. I don't blame him for not knowing. You can't know everything about everything. He knows a lot more about football and, like, his livelihood than I do. I was in the circles who would have happened to have been, I don't know, at 18 years old, you're going to fall for it. It just, a lot of good people are going to fall for it. It's not his job for not knowing the difference between an adoption or a conservatorship when everyone in his life has been put there to confuse him against his interests. Or at least has been put there by a convergence of interests, and when those interests diverge, they pick themselves. So if you want to take anything from this story or my take of the situation, family means you're in the will. And if you aren't in the will, you're not part of the family. I want to know, so Amy Coney Barrett is one of the Papist Supreme Court justices, and she's got, a few Black kids and a few white kids, biological white kids and adopted Black kids. And there was some curious things she said about her Black kids and white kids, like her white kids are all very smart and capable, and her Black kids are just nice and exuberant. And she kind of goes with that. And I just suspect if I were to look at Amy Coney Barrett's wills, I wouldn't be surprised if her white daughter gets a lot more than her Black son, in terms of authority on how to handle the estate. Right. So I do not trust. I'm not one of these people who think that the deracialized benevolence of good American Christians is going to actually lead to racial justice. I think we need to actually support Black families and support the parents of families so that they can actually mind their kids and shepherd their kids away from some of the more parasitic influences in society. That's what parents do. They're supposed to manage the parasites. And if you have a parasite that's in charge of managing the parasite, they're gonna, open the barn door and let it, they're gonna let all the bad influences in instead of keeping them out. And that is kind of a horrible, horrible situation that Oher found himself in. And sure, he's rich because he's an NFL player, but also the betrayal. I'm glad this is getting out. I'm glad this is getting out. Also, as an addendum, I think it's going to be a fascinating next 20 years in sports, because I think athletes themselves are going to start having podcasts like myself. And I'm the kind of vanguard of this. And I think you're going to find a lot of truth of black men telling about black men in a way that right now, in order to have any sort of distribution, you'd have to suck up to, some white producer. They'd write the appropriate Negro, or at least a Negro who was going to act appropriately in order for the endorsement payday. But now you'll get, but I think there's going to be a critical number of black guy retired athletes who made enough money and don't really want to make more, would rather just talk. And I think the podcast infrastructure, where you don't need too many other people approving you to get your voice out, is going to allow for a lot more people, right? So when I was growing up, it was, Jalen Rose was the one who had the mouth. He was the mouth. He was known for his mouth. He's been talking since he was one of the fabulous freshmen. But there are a lot of guys who are a lot funnier than Jalen Rose, and maybe not so addicted to money. And once they start getting the mics, it's going to be a fascinating time, because we're going to find out the truth about AAU. We're going to find out the truth about Pee Wee leagues. We're going to find out the truth about college recruiting. And all it takes is like one or two of these guys to be actually funny and legitimate. And I haven't been around. I know that they are. And then them not to care about money enough so that they'll screw up an endorsement deal with Adidas, to just say their truth, and it will be hilarious on the mic. Also, by the way, if someone actually could produce prison podcasts where inmates themselves ran this, that would be hilarious. It would be like a lot of horror stories too, but inmates are hilarious, and that would, and with the right producer, I think it would be fantastic. And since it would be a democratized infrastructure, they wouldn't just pick the prisoners with the right story of, well, I tried hard and I did wrong. No, you would actually just get prisoners talking their talk, in the same way that you don't have to get on Fox now, or you don't have to get on ESPN to have a microphone. You just need a microphone and a bonus room to launch your pod, and a few of your boys who are also 35 and retired to launch your pod, and it could be interesting. So I think it's going to be an interesting time in sports for the next 20 years. Sports commentators, when retired players who aren't particularly polite or polished, or entrapped or compromised by a Nike or an Adidas deal, start talking on their own pods. And we're getting a little bit of that now, but I think it's going to get live. It's going to get live in a few years, because they're not going to have well-produced hip-hop songs. It's just going to be them talking their talk with a regular guy on a podcast, and it's going to be hilarious, because the stories are hilarious and a little bit horrifying. So, thank you for your time. Thank you for your time, and I will see you on Thursday.